The first thing Nora noticed was not that her date was late. It was not the empty chair across from her, or the second glass the waiter had filled and she had not touched, or the way the whole warm room seemed to be enjoying itself at her expense. It was a voice from the table beside hers, low and careful, saying her name as though he had been practicing it for a very long time. Nora Bennett. She turned, and the summer evening tilted on its axis. She had spent 7 years teaching herself not to think about that face. She had gotten good at it. She could go weeks now without the memory of it surfacing, and when it did she could set it down again like a book she had already finished. But here it was in the flesh, 10 feet away at the next table, older and leaner and watching her with an expression she had no shelf to file it on. Daniel Mercer, the one person in the whole wide world she had not prepared to see across a restaurant on a Friday night in July. "You've been sitting there the entire time," she said. It was not a question. She had felt someone at that table for 40 minutes. The way you feel weather coming in off the water before the first drop lands. "I have," Daniel said. Behind him the terrace door stood open to the warm street, and the last light was going gold over the rooftops, and somewhere down the block the town's summer fair was tuning up its little stage for the weekend. None of it reached the small circle of air between their two tables. Nora looked at the chair across from her. Still empty. The man she was supposed to be meeting still a no-show. 40 minutes now and counting. Then she looked back at Daniel, and a cold, clear suspicion moved through her like a drought under a door. "How long?" she asked. "Have you been waiting?" He didn't answer that. Not right away. His hand went to his water glass and turned it a precise quarter turn on the cloth. 2 fingers testing the base of it as though it might be hot, and she hated that she remembered exactly where that habit came from. That it was a kitchen habit, that she had watched a younger version of that same hand do the same thing in her father's shop a lifetime ago. "Your wine's warm," he said instead. "You've been guarding it, not drinking it. You always did that when you were nervous. Guarded things you didn't want. Don't." The word came out sharper than she meant. Around them the restaurant went on, forks and low laughter and a smell of butter and burnt sugar drifting out of the kitchen, and Nora was suddenly aware that she was sitting in the green dress her sister had made her wear, alone, having been stood up in the most public possible way, and that the man who had stood her up was somehow sitting one table over watching it happen. "Tess set this up," she said, and it was not a guess, it was an arrival. She watched his jaw. She had always been able to read Daniel Mercer in his jaw. 7 years had changed a great deal about him, but not that. "My date. The one who never came through the door. That was you. This whole thing was you. Nora, answer the question I actually asked. How long have you been waiting?" He set the glass down and left it alone. He looked, for a moment, unbearably tired, the way a man looks who has rehearsed a scene so many times in the dark that saying it in the light feels like a kind of falling. "Your sister called me a month ago," he said. "She said you were on your own and stubborn about it, and that if I was ever coming home I ought to stop being a coward and do something about it. She didn't tell you who the date was because she knew you'd say no." She was right. You'd have said no. "I would have said no," Nora agreed. "I came at 7:30. I wanted to be sitting down before you arrived so it wouldn't feel like an ambush." A muscle moved in his cheek. "And then you walked in that dress, and you sat down at the table I'd booked for us, and I discovered that I could not make my legs cross the room. 7 years. 3 states. Every hard thing I ever taught myself to do. And I could not walk 10 feet across a dining room to a woman I already knew. So I took the next table, and I sat here for 40 minutes like a fool, watching you be stood up by the one person in the building who came early on purpose. The waiter drifted near, read the air, and drifted off again. Nora discovered that her hands had stopped their small work. They had been lining up the salt and pepper into a row, and the cutlery into a row, and now they were simply pressed flat against the tablecloth, holding her upright, and she made herself take them into her lap where he couldn't see them shake. 7 years, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own small mercy, and the very best you can do is sit at the next table. Yes, Daniel said quietly. That's about the size of it. The town would tell this story wrong for years afterward. It would say the celebrity chef came home to sweep the bookshop girl off her feet. It would say the whole thing was romantic and fast and destined. It was none of those. It was the slowest thing either of them ever did in their lives, and it took an entire summer, and there was more than one night in the middle of it when it very nearly did not happen at all. To understand why a woman would sit alone at a restaurant on the first Friday of July, stood up by a man she had never officially met, you have to go back to the shop. Everything with Nora went back to the shop. Bennett and Sons had stood on the corner of Alder and Fifth for 41 years, and there had never once been a son. Her father had liked the joke far too much to fix it. Marlowe Bennett had opened the bookshop the year he married Nora's mother, and had kept the name through the divorce, through the second marriage, through the slow gray decade when people stopped buying books on corners and started buying them on the little screens they carried in their pockets. He had kept it right up until 2 summers ago, when his heart had simply set down its work one bright morning between the poetry and the local history, and Nora had come home to find the shop dark and a folded note in his stiff hand that only said, in his terrible slanting script, "Mind the roof." She had minded the roof. She had minded all of it. She had left a steady, sensible design job in the city, come back to the town she had sworn she was finished with, and reopened Bennett and Sons with a coffee bar wedged into the old map alcove and a reading corner where the travel section used to be. 2 years on, it was still standing. It was, in its better months, very nearly making money. This was, in Nora's private accounting, the most successful thing she had ever done, and she was aware that saying so out loud would make her sound like a woman with a very small life. She had a small life. She had built it carefully, the way she straightened the shelves last thing every evening, spine by spine, until the whole wall was flush and even and nothing anywhere stuck out. A small life did not surprise you. A small life did not leave you standing at an altar or a train platform or a porch. Nora had decided a long time ago that she would rather have a life that never once thrilled her than one that could break her open, and on most days she believed the trade had been a bargain, and it was only in a certain slant of evening light, alone among the even shelves, that she suspected she had been robbed. The blind date had not been her idea. Nothing that frightened her was ever her idea. You need to meet someone who isn't a book, her sister had announced 3 weeks earlier, perched on the coffee bar with her heels hooked on the rail and a stolen biscuit in her hand. Tess was younger by 4 years and braver by a mile, and she said things like that without the faintest idea that they landed like small thrown stones. "One dinner, that's all. I've set the whole thing up already. He's perfect, Nor. He's kind, he's stupidly good-looking, and he actually reads, which for you is basically a scandal. Who is he? A surprise." Tess had grinned into her iced coffee. "If I tell you, you'll come up with 9 reasons to cancel, and I've only budgeted for 5. Friday, 8 o'clock. The new place 2 doors down. Wear the green dress. And do not, I am begging you, straighten a single thing for at least 1 hour." And Nora, because she loved her sister, and because she was tired in a way that sleep had stopped mending, had said all right. She had worn the green dress. She had sat down at 8 at the new restaurant that had opened that spring 2 doors from her own front door, the one with the quiet good name and the terrace and the maddening smell of something buttery and burnt sweet that had been drifting down the block for a month. She had ordered a glass of wine she couldn't taste and watched the door like a woman waiting for a verdict. He never came through it. At 20 past she had told herself he was parking. At half past she had told herself there was traffic, though there was never any traffic in this town, which was frankly the whole tragedy of the place. At 1:45 she had begun, very quietly, to line up the salt and the pepper, and her own 2 folded hands, and to perform for the waiter the small brave face of a woman who is fine, completely fine, who does this sort of thing all the time. That was when the voice at the next table had said her name, and the summer had properly begun. She did not know yet about the porch. That is, she knew about the porch the way you know about a scar you've stopped looking at. It was there, under everything. But she had built the whole even architecture of her life precisely so that she would never have to look at it directly. It would take Daniel Mercer 2 doors down and a whole July of ruined bread to make her look. Because there had been a porch once, that was the part the town never got right. Because the town had never known any of it. 7 years ago, there had been a boy who came into her father's shop every single evening at closing time and read cookbooks he could not afford to buy. He read them standing up, one narrow hip braced against the poetry shelf, turning the pages with clean and careful hands that smelled faintly of onions and dish soap because he worked doubles at the diner on 5th and dreamed a great deal too big for a boy who had grown up with nothing at all. Daniel Mercer, 23 years old, who could not pronounce a single French word on the page and mangled them so gloriously that Nora used to invent errands to walk past him. Pain perdu, he had read aloud one evening, Pane perdu, frowning fiercely at the word, and she had laughed so hard she dropped an entire stack of returns, and he had gone red to the tips of his ears and demanded to know what. What did I say? And she had not been able to tell him because she could not get her breath. Lost bread, she had finally managed, wiping her eyes. It means lost bread. You take the loaf that's gone hard, the stale one everybody's already given up on, and you soak it, and you cook it, and it comes out better than it ever was when it was fresh. And Daniel Mercer had looked at her across the poetry section as though she had just handed him the entire world, and said, very seriously, that is the best thing I have ever heard in my life, and neither one of them had been talking about breakfast. He was going to leave that autumn. He had earned a place in a real kitchen 3 states away, the first rung of the only ladder he had ever wanted to climb, and he had spent the summer half in her father's shop and half in a fever about it. On the last warm night in September, he had walked to her house to say some brave, enormous thing. She had seen it on his face as he came up the garden path in the porch light, seen it the way you see a wave coming and know it is already too late to move. And she had been standing on that porch with Peter Vance's ring on her hand. She had said yes to Peter 2 days before. Peter Vance, who was steady and local and thoroughly approved of, who would never once in his life read a cookbook standing up because he wanted a thing too badly to be able to afford it. Peter, whom her stepmother adored, whom Nora's whole careful, sensible terror had chosen for her without ever quite asking her permission. She had looked at Daniel coming up the path with his heart held out in his 2 open hands, and she had turned her own hand so that the ring caught the porch light, so that he would see it before he could say whatever he had come to say, so that she would not have to be the one to break the thing herself. He had seen it. He had stopped on the 2nd step. And then Daniel Mercer, who was always braver than she was, had smiled a smile that plainly cost him everything he had, and said, I only came to say goodbye, Bennett. Mind the shop. And he had turned around and gone back down the path into the dark, and out of the town, and up his ladder, and she had let him. She married no one. The engagement to Peter had lasted 11 months and ended without any drama at all, because Peter was not a fool and could see plainly that he had come in third, after a bookshop and a ghost. But by then Daniel was long gone into his kitchens and his cities, and the years had closed over the whole thing the way still water closes over a dropped stone. And she had built her small, even, orderly life directly on top of the exact place where he used to stand and read, and had told herself, every night, spine by spine, that it was enough. Now he was 2 doors down, cooking lost bread for strangers, and her sister had tricked her into a green dress, and the summer had only just started. Nora did not sleep that first night. She paid for her untouched wine over Daniel's objection, walked the 2 doors home to the dark shop, and let herself in and sat down on the floor of the reading corner in the green dress and did not cry, because she had trained herself out of that a long time ago. She looked at the wall of books she had made so perfectly even, and for the first time in 2 years it did not comfort her. It looked like a wall that a frightened person had built. It looked, in fact, exactly like what it was. Upstairs she took out the ring. She kept it in a small dish on the windowsill, a thin plain band that had been her father's, and she wore it on a chain some days and left it home on others, and she turned it now between her fingers in the blue dark and thought about porches and stairs and all the small brave things she had never done. The gifts started on Monday. The first one was simply there on the step when she opened up, a single loaf of bread, dense and dark and still faintly warm through its brown paper, left with no note at all. She stood in the doorway holding it and looked 2 doors down to where the alder's windows were propped open to the July morning, and a figure in white kitchen clothes moved once across the bright gap and did not look up. And she understood with a sinking, rising feeling that this was going to be a whole summer, and that she was not going to be able to straighten her way out of it. She brought the loaf inside. She did not eat it. On principle, on fear, on a stubbornness she had inherited directly from a man who had kept a bookshop with no sons in it, purely to spite the century. She set the loaf on the coffee bar where she would have to look at it, and it went hard over 3 days exactly as he must have known that it would, and on the 4th morning she stood in her own dark kitchen at 6 o'clock and soaked it in egg and cooked it in butter, furious the entire time, and it was of course the best thing she had eaten in 2 years. She did not thank him. That became the shape of the first 2 weeks. He would leave a thing on the step, and she would refuse absolutely to be moved by it, and she would be moved by it anyway, down to the floor of herself. A jar of apricot preserves, the same kind her father used to keep behind the till for children who came in with sticky coins. A single perfect peach at the very height of the heat, when the whole town smelled of split fruit and cut grass and hot pavement. A small paper bag of the burnt sugar ends of something, the crumbling caramelized scraps that any fine kitchen in the world would have swept straight into the compost, left on her step because he had remembered, across 7 years and 3 states. That a girl had once told him that the ruined thing could be the best thing if you only knew what to do with it. "He's courting you with actual garbage," Tess said, delighted, sitting on the coffee bar the following Wednesday with a peach in her hand that she had absolutely stolen from the evidence pile. "I want that on the record. This is the single most romantic thing I have ever witnessed, and it is composed entirely of stuff he was going to throw away. He is not courting me. He's making a point." "What's the point?" Nora took the peach back out of her sister's hand. "That I threw away the loaf," she said, 7 years ago. "He's reminding me I did it." Tess stopped chewing. She had been 16 years old that summer, and she had privately and completely adored the tall, serious boy who read cookbooks standing up in their father's shop, and she had cried real tears when he left and had never entirely forgiven her older sister for the going of him. She looked at Nora now with something in her face that was older than the rest of her. "You didn't throw him away, Nora," she said. "You put a ring on to keep from having to want anything that much. There's a difference." She hopped down off the bar. "It's not a big difference, but it's a real one, and you've been pretending for 7 years that you can't see it," which was the single truest thing anyone said to Nora that whole month, and she carried it around afterward like a splinter she couldn't quite reach, in a place she couldn't quite name. She lasted exactly 9 days of not thanking him before the not thanking became its own kind of louder, in the end, than any thank you could ever have been, and on the 10th evening she took off her apron, told Tess to mind the till, and walked the 2 doors down in the last of the July light to have it out with the man in person. The altar at the full height of dinner service was a different country, and she stood just inside the door for a full minute before a single soul noticed her. Watching, Daniel was at the pass in the roar and steam and clatter of it, calling times in a low, even voice that the entire line bent toward the way plants bend toward a window, wholly in command of a room full of fire and knives and grown men who plainly worshipped the ground he stood on. A young cook slid a plate under his hand. He touched it once, turned it a precise quarter turn, said something too quiet to hear, and the boy grinned as though he had just been knighted on the spot. It was the single most unfair thing Nora had ever seen in her life. The boy who had mangled Payne Perdue standing up in her father's shop had become this, somewhere out in the 7 years she had not been given, and she had not been present for 1 hour of the becoming, and the grief of that arrived in her so suddenly and so hard that she very nearly turned and left before he could see her at all. He saw her. The whole roaring machine of the kitchen went on cooking without its captain for a long moment while he simply looked at her across the length of it, and then he wiped his hands on the towel at his waist and came out to where she stood by the door. "I am not going to eat your bread," she said. "I want that clearly understood. I have walked 2 doors in front of the whole town to tell you to your face that I know precisely what you are doing and that it is not going to work on me." "All right," Daniel said. Behind him a pan flared and someone called a time back to the empty pass, and the warm night pressed in through the propped open windows, smelling of butter and the far sea. "What am I doing?" "You are being patient at me." She had meant it to come out as an accusation, hard and flat as a shut door, and it came out instead as something perilously near a plea, and she hated that he heard the difference. She could see him hear it. "You are standing 2 doors away being generous and patient and good, and you are simply waiting for me to crack, because you already know perfectly well that I will. And it is the cruelest thing that anyone has ever done to me, and you are doing it on purpose, and you are not even a little bit sorry." He was quiet for a moment. The line behind him had noticed, the way kitchens notice absolutely everything, and was very industriously pretending that it had not. "I waited 7 years, Nora," he said at last, gently. "I expect I can manage the rest of 1 summer." And she turned and walked back out into the blue street before he could watch what that sentence did to her face. And he let her go, and did not follow her, and neither one of them had thanked the other for a single thing. It was, she understood on the short walk home past his bright windows to her own dark ones, the very closest she had come to being happy in longer than she could bear to count on both her hands. The trouble with Peter Vance was that he came back too. He was not a ghost. He was something worse, a living man with a leather folder. Peter had made himself into a property developer in the years since Nora had handed his ring back across a kitchen table, had grown prosperous and pleasant and slightly soft around the jaw, and he arrived at Bennett & Sons on a bright Thursday with the folder and a coffee he ordered and paid for, and a smile that did not quite reach the outer corners of anything. I'm going to be straight with you, because you've earned that from me, Peter said, settling onto a stool at her coffee bar and turning the cup a careful quarter turn on its saucer. And she thought, with a small internal lurch, that everyone she had ever loved turned cups. I hold the freehold on 4 of the 6 units on this row already. Yours and the Alder are the last 2 standing. I'm putting up something this town honestly needs, Nora. Apartments people who grew up here can actually afford. A proper square with trees in it. It's a good project. I'm not the villain of anybody's story. Nobody ever thinks they're the villain, Peter. That's the whole trouble with villains. He took the hit with good grace. He always had. I'm offering well above market. Well above. Enough that you would never have to mind a roof again as long as you live. He said it gently, and it was the gentleness that landed, because he knew exactly what her father's shop cost her. He had always known. He had loved her once with his eyes wide open. You could do anything with money like that. Open a shop somewhere the rent isn't a slow leak in the bottom of the boat, or open nothing at all. You could rest, Nora. When is the last time you rested? And the genuinely terrible thing was that a part of Nora, the small, even careful part that lined up the spines at night, wanted to say yes to him on the spot. To be finished, to set down the roof at last, to take the safe, enormous money and vanish into a life that could never break her. It was the exact same voice that had put Peter's ring on her hand 7 years before. She recognized it instantly, in her own chest, and it frightened her badly that after everything it still sounded so entirely reasonable. "I'll think about it," she said, which was what she said to everything, always, forever. Peter left the folder on the bar. At the door he paused and looked 2 doors down toward the Alder, and something crossed his pleasant face that she could not read. "He knows about the offer, by the way," Peter said. "Mercer, I made him the identical one last week. He turned me down flat, wouldn't even open the folder. A dry, rueful little sound. You two always did have a real gift for making my life difficult without so much as coordinating your schedules." And he touched the doorframe once and went, and the bell rang him out into the heat. She held out a few days more after Peter's visit. On principle, on fear, on the family stubbornness. And then the roof of Bennett and Sons, the roof she had been instructed 100 times to mind, chose the single hottest afternoon of the entire year to give up a long seam of its old flashing, and the summer storm that had been stacking itself up black over the water all week came down at last through the ceiling of the local history section like the sky itself had a personal grudge against her. Nora stood in 2 inches of rising water, clutching a cardboard box of irreplaceable town records against her chest. The parish registers and the flood maps and the only photographs of streets that no longer existed. And she understood with total clarity that she was going to have to ask another human being for help, right now, and that there was exactly one person on the whole drowning block who would actually come. He came. Of course he came. He came in his kitchen whites with the sleeves already shoved to the elbow, and he did not say, "I told you to mind the roof," and he did not say one single word about 7 years. He simply waded in and took the heavy end of everything, and for 2 hours in the drumming. Roaring rain, the two of them saved what could be saved, passing box after box hand to hand up the narrow stairs, not talking, moving around each other in the small, flooded rooms with the terrible, easy, wordless rhythm of 2 people who had once spent an entire summer learning exactly where the other one would be standing. When it was over, they sat down side by side on the stairs, both of them soaked straight through, the storm sliding away east and grumbling. Daniel handed her a dry towel he'd found somewhere, and she handed him, in exchange, a dusty bottle of her father's genuinely terrible cooking sherry, because it was the only thing in the entire shop that wasn't wet. They drank it out of 2 coffee mugs. It was disgusting. They both started laughing, and it was the first time she had laughed in his company in 7 years, and it hurt like warmth coming back into a foot that had gone numb. "Why did you turn down Peter's money?" she asked. The sherry had made her either brave or careless. She had long ago lost the ability to tell those two apart. "You could open a place absolutely anywhere. Why here? Why this exact town that was never once kind to you a single day of your childhood?" Daniel looked down into the mug in his hands for a long moment. Outside, the rain had softened to a hush, and the light was coming back, gold and rinsed and forgiven. The way it always does after a summer storm has spent itself, sliding along the wet street and in through the streaming windows. "Because you're here," he said. Simply, like a man finally setting down a box he had been carrying so long that he'd forgotten his arms were full. "I built the whole thing so I could come back and be a man you'd be allowed to choose in the daylight. That was the entire plan, start to finish. Get good enough. Get known enough. Get all the way to where nobody in this place could look at me the way they used to look at me and be right about it." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "And then I finally got here, and I found out it didn't matter in the least how good I'd gotten, because you were never going to choose me over the safe thing. You proved that to me on a porch when you were 21. So," he took a swallow of the terrible sherry, "I honestly don't know why I'm here, Nora. I only know I couldn't be anywhere else." She should have said something. She had the whole entire truth of it right there in her mouth for one hot, rinsed, golden second, 7 years of it, ready. And then the old, even careful voice rose up in her, the spine-straightening voice, the ring on the hand voice. And it said very quietly and very reasonably, "He'll leave the second something better calls him. They always leave. You'll be second all over again." And Nora Bennett, who was so much braver about roofs than about her own heart, said instead, "Thank you for the boxes." She watched it land on him. She watched him fold it away neatly, the way he folded every hurt, and stand, and set the mug down with 2 careful fingers. "Any time," Daniel said, and went home the 2 doors down through the wet gold light, and she sat alone on the stairs of her father's half-drowned shop and hated herself with a thoroughness she usually saved for other people entirely. The town fair took over Alder Street the 2nd week of July, the way it did every single summer, and Nora, who normally locked the shop door and hid behind a do-not-disturb face until it was over, found herself out on the hot, bright, crowded street among the stalls. Because the Alder had a booth, and the Alder's booth was giving away lost bread. Daniel had turned the entire thing into a joke that only one person in the whole crowd could hear. A hand-lettered sign above the griddle read simply, "Pain perdu." Free, and underneath, in smaller letters, it means lost bread. The ruined loaf made better than new. There was a line of townspeople 40 deep in the heat, eating French toast off paper napkins and telling one another it was the finest thing they had ever put in their mouths. And not a single one of them had the faintest idea that they were standing inside the oldest unsent love letter in the county. Nora joined the very back of the line. She stood in it for 20 minutes in the July sun, and when she finally reached the front, Daniel looked up from the griddle, and the whole loud fair seemed to drop clean away, leaving just the 2 of them and the hiss of the pan. He plated a piece for her without a word and set it on the counter between them, dusted white with sugar, the burnt sweet smell of it rising up into the space between their faces. "You're impossible," she said. "I'm consistent," he said. "There's a difference." And then, because a boy in whites was elbowing him urgently for the spatula, and the formidable matriarch of the Historical Society was loudly demanding the recipe as though it were owed to her by law, and the whole pressing town was closing in, he leaned across the hot counter and said, "Lo, only for her." Come to the kitchen after the fair packs up. The real one. I want to show you the thing I actually built. No boxes, no offers, just come and see it once. But the town, having gotten a look at her standing at his counter, was not going to let the two of them alone that easily, and the reckoning with the town came first. It came the following week, at a dinner. The Alder held a proper opening night at last, a long table of the county's better people, and half of Nora did not want to go and all of her went, in the green dress, because Daniel had asked her plainly, and she had run out of the strength to say no to plain asking. It was going beautifully, the food coming out course after impossible course, until somewhere around the third one an old money man named Harding, who had known the town when the Mercers were the family you hired and never the family you sat with, set down his fork and said, to the whole bright end of the table, in the carrying voice of a man who has never once been told to lower it, "Remarkable, really, when I think of where this boy started. Washing dishes at the diner, wasn't it? His mother did for half the houses on the hill. And here he is, playing Lord of the Manor. Only in this day and age." The table went very still. A fork stopped somewhere. Daniel, who had come out of the kitchen to pour the wine himself, stood there in his whites with the bottle in his hand, and Nora watched 7 years of hard-won armor go on over the boy who had read cookbooks standing up, because he could not afford to sit. But he did not flinch, and he did not rage, and that was the thing that undid her. He set the bottle down gently on the cloth. "You're right, Mr. Harding," Daniel said, and his voice was perfectly even, perfectly warm. The quiet dignity she would later understand had cost him everything to learn. "My mother did for half the houses on the hill. Yours included. She used to bring home whatever the kitchens threw out at the end of the week, and she taught me that there was no such thing as a ruined loaf, only a cook who'd given up too early. Everything I know that's worth anything I learned from a woman scraping other people's plates." He picked the bottle back up. "I named the bread on your plate after her. More wine?" And the table, which had been braced to watch a poor boy be put in his place, found itself instead quietly ashamed, and Harding had the grace to color, and the moment turned, and Nora sat there with her heart going like a struck bell, and understood that she was looking at the bravest man she had ever known, and that she had let him walk down a garden path into the dark 7 years ago, because she had been too frightened to be brave alongside him for even one night. Her stepmother had been at that dinner. Diane Bennett missed nothing in this town. It was practically her profession. And 2 days later she arrived at the shop at closing, without knocking, because Diane had never once in 20 years knocked before entering a room she felt entitled to, and she came, Nora understood at once, to put a stop to things. "You are making a spectacle of yourself over the Mercer boy," Diane said, without preamble, setting her handbag on the coffee bar like a gavel. "The whole county saw you at that dinner looking at him as though he'd hung the moon. I did not raise you to hang your happiness on a man who claws his way up from nothing, Nora, because I will tell you exactly how that story ends. Men like that are climbing. They are always climbing. You will be one more rung to him, and the day a better rung appears in a bigger city, he will do to you precisely what he did the last time, which is walk down the path and out of the town, and not look back. He left before. That is the only fact about him that matters. He left." Nora set down the book she was shelving. She did not raise her voice. She had learned something at that long table 2 nights before about what quiet could carry. "He left," Nora said, "because I put another man's ring on my hand and turned it to the light so he'd see it before he could ask me for anything. He didn't leave me, Diane. I sent him. And I have spent 7 years letting you tell me that the story was the other way round, because it was so much easier to be the one who got left than the one who was too much of a coward to be chosen. So no, I won't hear that he left. From you, in my father's shop, tonight, that one's mine. I sent him down that path, and I'm done pretending I didn't." Diane's mouth opened and closed. Something moved behind her competent face, some old grief turning over in its sleep, and for a moment Nora thought she might actually say the true thing, whatever it was. But Diane Bennett was not built for standing in tender rooms. She picked her handbag back up off the bar. "You'll do as you like," she said stiffly. "You always have." And she went, and the bell rang her out, and it was not until much later that Nora understood she had won that argument, and that winning it had cost Diane far more than losing it would have, and that a woman who retreats to think is not the same as a woman who has been beaten. Nora went to the kitchen that night, after the fair and the dinner and the fight, because she had finally run out of reasons not to. The Alder at 11 o'clock at night, the last diner gone, the front lights low, was the cleanest, calmest, most alive place Nora had ever stood inside. Daniel moved through it the way a man moves through a chapel he built with his own 2 hands. He showed her the ovens he had saved 4 years to buy. He showed her the little walled garden out the back where he grew the herbs, silver green and fragrant in the warm dark, and the long steel pass, and then, almost shyly, the one framed thing on the wall above it. She went close to look, and her breath went strange in her chest, because it was a single page torn from a cookbook, water-stained and soft with handling, carried plainly through 3 states and 7 years, and written across the top of it in a young man's furious, careful hand, phonetically, so that he could learn to say it right, was peine perdue. And underneath that, in her own handwriting from another lifetime, on the back of a shop receipt he had somehow kept all this time, lost bread. The ruined thing, better than new. "N, you kept a receipt," she said. Her voice had gone somewhere she couldn't govern. "I kept everything," Daniel said. "That's the part nobody warns you about. When you leave, you go, and you build the whole big impressive life you swore you'd build, and the entire time you've got a shop receipt folded up in your wallet so you don't forget how to want something you were never allowed to have." And then he made her lost bread at midnight, the way he had first learned it standing up in her father's shop, cracking the eggs one-handed, testing the pan with 2 fingers. And they ate it side by side at the steel counter with their hands, and he made her laugh 3 separate times, and the 3rd time it was an actual joke, dry and quiet and perfectly built, about a boy who had once been certain that peine perdue was a variety of pasta. She laughed, and then she stopped laughing. Because she had felt the ground shift, he had learned to be funny somewhere in those 7 years. There were whole rooms of this man she had never once been inside, and instead of frightening her the way everything frightened her, it undid her completely, and she looked at him across the low-lit steel and said, "I gave you back nothing. That whole summer, you handed me everything you had, and I gave you a receipt and a ring on somebody else's account. You gave me lost bread," Daniel said. "You gave me the only idea I've ever had that was worth a thing, that the ruined loaf, the one everybody's already given up on, that's the one you don't throw out. That's the one you take home." He was very still in the low light. "I built a whole life on your idea, Nora. I got famous on it. I just could never once figure out how to take my own best advice where you were concerned." She kissed him. She, Nora Bennett, who straightened spines and minded roofs and had chosen the safe door on a September porch, crossed the final 10 feet of the last 7 years and kissed him in the clean, bright midnight kitchen. And he made a sound like a man setting down a box he had carried so long he had stopped feeling the weight of it, and he kissed her back with his flour-dusted hands framing her face like something he had been handed and could not quite believe he was allowed to keep. For 3 weeks after that, The summer was kind, and this was the stretch Nora would return to again and again in the dark. Later, when the old belief got loud, the 3 golden weeks in the middle of July, when she finally let herself simply have the thing. They were careful, and they were not careful. He learned her closing routine and began appearing at 9 o'clock to help her straighten the shelves, and discovered within a night that if he deliberately left one single book sticking half an inch proud of the others, she could not sleep, and so he did it every night for the joy of watching her mutter. And it became the stupidest and dearest ongoing fight in the world. She learned his opening routine and started appearing at 6 in the morning to watch him bake, and he taught her real things: how to test a hot pan with the back of 2 fingers, how to know by smell alone when the bread had gone properly stale. And she was hopeless at every bit of it, and he was so patient about her hopelessness that it made her want to sit down on the floor and weep. On the hottest evening of that whole golden stretch, they fixed the roof. Properly, this time, not the frantic storm night triage with the boxes and the buckets, but the real and deliberate thing. Daniel turned up at closing with a borrowed ladder over one shoulder and a pail of black sealant in his other hand, and a flat, cheerful refusal to hear one single word about it being her roof and therefore her problem to mind alone. They went up together into the long gold light after the shop was shut, and they patched the long seam of old flashing that had let the whole storm in, working on their knees on the warm tar while the light went slowly down over the water. And Nora was every bit as hopeless at roofing as she was at hot pans, and Daniel was exactly as patient about the one as he was about the other, which was to say maddeningly, wonderfully, entirely. When it was done, they did not climb straight back down the ladder. They sat up there instead, side by side with their backs against the low parapet and the drying tar gone tacky under their hands, and watched the whole small town go blue beneath them and then violet, the lights coming on one lit window at a time, the far-off wheeze of the fair packing up its little stage for the night drifting over the rooftops on the warm air. "My father used to come up here," Nora said after a while. "I never once knew why. He would just vanish up the ladder some evenings and be gone the better part of an hour, and I used to think he was hiding from the shop, or from me, or from Diane." She looked out over the town that had never in 40 years been kind to the man sitting beside her. I think now he only ever wanted to see the whole of it at once, from up high, in the dark, where all the mess of the day turns into nothing but lights. Daniel did not say anything to that for a moment. Then he reached over in the warm blue dark and took her hand, tar black and roughened and all, and held it in his own on the warm roof between them, and they sat and watched the small, ungrateful town he had crossed 3 states and 7 years to come home and be worthy of. And Nora felt the plain, specific, unhurried weight of a hand that was not going anywhere, not up a ladder, not down a garden path, not out of the town in the dark, and she did not, for once in her whole governed life, feel the smallest flicker of the old urge to straighten the moment, or to improve it, or to guard herself against the sheer size of it. She simply let it be exactly as good as it already was, which was a thing she had genuinely not known until that evening on the roof that she was even able to do. "I minded your roof, Bennett," Daniel said at last, gravely, into the deepening dark. "You will note that I did that. When the time comes to tell this whole story properly, I want it entered into the permanent record that I was extremely good about the roof. It is my roof. It is an alphabetical roof," he said. "Bennett, and then Mercer. You come first even in the roofing, you will observe." And Nora laughed up at the first of the stars, a real laugh, and it carried out clear over the sleeping rooftops. And 2 doors down the last low light in the Alder's kitchen burned patiently on, in no hurry in all the world, waiting for him to come home to it whenever he was good and ready. There was a Sunday, too, in the very middle of the 3 weeks, when Daniel closed the altar to the public and cooked instead for his own people. The family meal, he called it. The one dinner in the week when the whole young ferocious crew of the kitchen sat down together at the long steel pass and were cooked for instead of cooking. He asked Nora to come, plainly the way he asked her everything now, and she went. She had braced herself on the short walk over to be inspected. She was the boss's woman, the bookshop girl out of whatever sad half-story the older cooks all surely knew, and she had expected to be weighed and measured and found wanting. Instead, she was simply folded straight in. A tattooed girl of 19 named Ro, who ran the cold station and feared precisely nothing on this earth, Daniel included, put a glass of wine into Nora's hand and a plate of something quietly extraordinary in front of her, and demanded, without any preamble whatsoever, to be told every single embarrassing thing the chef had ever done back before he was famous. And Nora, after one startled moment, discovered that she was in possession of a very great many of them, and told them, and the whole long table laughed until the cutlery rang against the steel. The French he had mangled, the cookbooks he had read standing up, because he could afford neither the chair nor the book, the fierce red-eared seriousness of him at 23 years old. Daniel sat at the head of his own table and bore all of it with the wide, undefended face of a man who did not in the least mind being loved out loud, in a room by the people he had chosen. It undid her a little, watching it. These were his. He had made them, the way her father had made the shop, the way she had made the even and orderly shelves. He had built himself a whole warm, loud family 3 states from home out of nothing at all but talent and stubbornness and lost bread, and there were, she understood then, whole rooms of this man that she had never once yet been inside. Years of rooms, crowded and bright, and instead of frightening her the way that everything on God's earth had always frightened her, the sheer size of it only made her want, quite fiercely, and for the first time in her careful life, to go and open every single door. "They love you," she said to him after in the emptying kitchen, drying glasses at his elbow, because she could never sit still while other people were working, that whole lot. "They would walk through a wall for you. They put up with me," Daniel said. "There's a difference." He took the glass out of her hands and set it down on the steel, and looked at her in the low light of the room he had built with his own 2 hands. "I worked out a long time ago that if you feed people well enough, and you stay patient enough with them while they are still bad at the thing, they will forgive you very nearly anything at all. I learned it off a girl in a bookshop, as it happens. She told me you never once throw out the ruined loaf. You only have to be willing to give it the time." And Nora set down the towel and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing left anywhere in the whole warm, bright room that needed saying. There was a morning near the very end of July, the best one, the one she would keep. They sat together in the empty restaurant at dawn with the doors open to the cool early street and the light coming up pink and then gold over the rooftops, and Daniel was folding napkins with the total absolute concentration he brought to every small thing. And he said, not even looking up, as easy and ordinary as breathing, "When we do the fair next summer, I'm putting your name on the booth alongside mine. Bennett and Mercer. Lost bread and old books. Nobody in town will have the first idea what it means, and we are never going to tell them." And Nora, sitting there hearing the words next summer and your name, and we all folded together into one completely ordinary sentence about napkins, felt something turn over in her chest that she had spent 7 years refusing to let move, the specific, terrifying feeling of a future that had her own name written into it, spoken out loud by someone who wanted her inside it, first in the plain daylight. "Bennett and Mercer," she repeated, just to taste the shape of it. "It's purely alphabetical," Daniel said gravely, folding another napkin into a sharp, exact triangle. "Don't you dare read anything into it." And she threw a napkin at his head, and he caught it without looking, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her even in the very middle of her own happiness, "I have never once had this. In my whole life, I have never had this." And a small, cold voice, the oldest voice she owned, said back, gently, almost kindly, "And that is exactly how you will know when you lose it." She lost it 4 days later, and it came, the way the worst things always seem to, wearing the clothes of good news. Nora went to the county office to file the insurance claim on the ruined roof, and the clerk behind the counter, an old friend of her father's with kind, tired eyes, pulled up the block records to confirm the freehold status for the paperwork, and frowned at his screen and said, "Well now, that's already sorted, love. The whole building's freehold. Bought outright, 3 weeks back. You didn't know? It's held under a management company, but the beneficial owner is listed right here, plain as day." And he turned the monitor toward her, kindly, helpfully, wanting only to save her a headache, and Nora read the name of the man who now owned the ground her father's shop stood on, the roof she had been minding her whole life, the walls, the floors, all of it. And it was not Peter Vance. It was Daniel Mercer, bought 3 weeks ago, the very same week he had brought her into the kitchen at midnight, the exact same week she had finally crossed the room. She stood on the hot pavement outside the county office, with the claim form slowly crumpling in her fist, and felt the entire golden summer go stale in one single breath, and not the good kind of stale, not the kind you soak in egg and rescue and take home. The other kind, the kind you throw away. He had bought it. He had bought her out from under Peter without telling her a word. He had quietly solved her roof, her rent, her slow bleed, her whole small even life 3 weeks ago with the enormous money she would never have, and then he had made her lost bread at midnight and let her fall the whole way and had never once said, "By the way, I own your father's shop now." He had fixed her, quietly and completely, the way a person fixes a thing he does not respect enough to consult first, the way you rescue a stray from the side of the road. She was, all over again, precisely the thing she had spent her whole life in terror of being. A project. A charity. The ruined loaf somebody takes home in order to feel generous about himself. Second, not chosen. Managed, she could hear the old voice, and for once it was not cruel to her. For once it was gentle and sad and almost tender, and it said, "I told you. I always told you, love, they handle you. Nobody ever simply chooses you." And the truly unbearable part, the part that put her on her knees on the floor of the reading corner that night for the first time in 2 whole years, was that she had let herself genuinely believe otherwise for 21 days, and the fall back down out of it was so much farther and so much harder than it would have been if she had only had the sense never to have climbed up at all. She did not open the shop at 6 the next morning. She sat in the dark reading corner among the still water-stained local history, and she did not soak any bread. And when Daniel knocked at 9, having of course heard, because the town was the size of a thimble and twice as talkative, she opened the door, but not the way in. "You bought the building," she said. "Nora, you bought my father's building 3 weeks ago, and you cooked me French toast, and you stood there and let me fall in love with you in your own kitchen, and you never once said a single word." Her voice was very calm, and she realized in the middle of saying it that she had learned the calm from him, at a long table, from a poor boy answering a rich one without raising his voice. Quiet dignity. He had taught it to her without either of them noticing the lesson. "Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just going to let me find out from a clerk that I'm a line item on your property portfolio?" The ruined little shop the successful man swept in and saved. It's very tidy, Daniel. It's very, very you. That is not. He stopped himself. She watched him begin to fold it away, the way he folded every wound, and then, for the first time since she had known him, refused to fold it. I bought it to keep Peter from getting it, he said. To keep him from putting you out on the street in September. I did it fast, and I did it quiet, because I absolutely knew, that if I told you, you would do exactly this. You would find the one version of it that makes you the rescued one, the second one, the managed one, and you would use that version to run. Because that is what you do, Nora. When something matters too much, you find the ring. You find the safe way not to want the thing so badly it could hurt you. I have watched you do it your entire life. Don't. You did it on the stairs after the storm. You've done it 3 nights a week over those shelves. You are doing it right now, on this doorstep in front of me. His voice cracked, finally, the first time in her life she had ever heard it break, and the break was worse than any shouting could have been. I did not buy you a building. I bought you time. I gave you the one single thing I have that you don't. And I hid it inside a company so that you would never even have to know it existed, so that it could never once sit between us as a debt. And the only mistake I made in the whole of it was believing I could love you quietly enough that you wouldn't manage to turn it into fresh proof that nobody in this world chooses you. You should have told me. Yes, Daniel said. I should have. That is the one true thing standing in this doorway. I should have told you, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for it. And he stood there in the doorway of her father's shop, having done the single most generous thing anyone had ever done for her in her life, waiting only to be forgiven for the manner of the doing of it. And Nora, with 7 years of the old cold fear roaring in her ears like the storm through the roof, could not do it. I need you to go, she said. He went. He set it down, and he folded it away, and he walked the 2 doors down to the kitchen he had built to be worthy of her, and Nora closed the door of the shop and slid down the back of it to the floor. And this time she did cry. At last. 7 years of it all at once, alone in the dark among the ruined books, having thrown away the loaf for the second time in her one life, and knowing it, and doing it anyway, because being managed felt so terribly much like being loved that she could no longer tell which of the 2 of them was the one that always left. Her stepmother found her there the next morning. Diane let herself into the dark shop with her own key at 8 o'clock, took one long look at Nora gray-faced and hollow behind the coffee bar, and set down a covered dish and her handbag and her considerable opinions in that order. You look like something the river gave back, Diane said. Drink this before you say a word to me. It was tea. It was unaccountably made exactly the way Nora's father had always made it, strong and scandalously oversweet, and Nora had not known that Diane knew how, and the small unbearable kindness of it from this woman of all the women in the world very nearly finished what the night had started. Nora and her stepmother had spent 2 full decades in a state of armed and perfect courtesy. Diane had married Marlowe when Nora was 8, had raised her with a brisk competence that never once softened into anything you could call tenderness, and had been, Nora had always privately believed, the entire architect of the safe life, the one who had approved so warmly of Peter, who spoke of security as though it were simply another word for love, who had taught Nora through 1,000 small daily lessons that a woman's one real job in the world was to choose the door that would not one day slam on her fingers. If there was a single living human being Nora had always blamed for the ring on the porch, it was the woman now standing in the shop pouring her late husband's tea. I know about the chef, Diane said, sitting down. The whole town knows about the chef. I know he bought this building, and I know you've thrown him out over it, and I know you are absolutely certain I've come here this morning to tell you good riddance to bad rubbish." She wrapped both her hands around her own cup, and Nora saw, with a small shock, that they were not quite steady. "I have not." "Then why are you here, Diane?" Diane was quiet for a long moment, looking down into her tea, and Nora, watching her, remembered suddenly a thing she had seen 3 weeks earlier and had not understood and had filed away under the heading of things that simply could not be true. Passing the churchyard at dusk on her way home from the fair, she had seen her stepmother standing alone at Marlowe's grave, not tidying it, not arranging flowers, not performing grief for any watching eye, just standing, with one hand laid flat on the top of the stone the exact way you would rest a hand on a living shoulder, her whole rigid, competent body bowed around something entirely private, and in her other hand she had been holding a pair of reading glasses. His reading glasses, that she must have carried all the way there in her handbag and could not, even after 2 years, make herself leave behind. Nora had walked on quickly and told no one, and had never once let herself think about it again until this moment. "I chose safe," Diane said now, still to her tea. "When I was your age exactly. There was a man, it doesn't matter who he was now. There was a man who wanted me to go off with him, more or less to sea, to a life with no floor under it at all, and I looked at every single thing that could possibly go wrong, and I married a steady widower with a failing bookshop and a sharp little girl who did not like me one bit. Instead, she said it plainly. Without a scrap of self-pity, a woman reading aloud from a ledger she had balanced long ago. And I was happy, Nora. I need you to hear that part, because it is the part that makes the whole thing so dangerous. I loved your father. I was happy inside the safe life. Safe is not a lie. That is what nobody ever tells you, and it is the cruelest part. It works. It is warm. You can live an entire good and happy life inside it." She looked up, at last, and her eyes were wet, and Nora had never in 20 years seen that happen. "And then one ordinary morning he is simply gone," Diane said, "and you find yourself standing at a stone in a churchyard with his reading glasses in your hand, and you discover that the one single thing safe never once does. The whole time, underneath all the warmth, is stop you wondering about the sea, about the man, about the enormous, frightening, ungovernable life you were far too sensible to let yourself want. I taught you to be exactly like me, because it was the only way I knew to keep you from ever being hurt, the way I'd watched women be hurt. And I have stood by and watched it keep you from being happy for 7 years. And now I am watching you do it to yourself all over again, and I find that I cannot sit inside my grief with you, this morning, and let you make my life twice. I will not." "You approved of Peter," Nora said, uselessly, because the whole floor of the world was moving under her. "I was terrified of the other one," Diane said, "the boy who read the cookbook standing up. I saw the way you looked at him across that shop, and it frightened the living life out of me, because that particular kind of wanting is exactly the kind that ends with a woman at a grave holding a lost man's glasses and grieving a life she got to keep. So yes, I pushed you at Peter Vance with both hands. I helped you find the ring. I told you it was sensible, and I told you it was love, and I let you believe those were the same word." Her jaw set into its familiar hard line. "It is the worst thing I have ever done to another person, and I did every bit of it out of love, which, I have learned, is precisely how the worst things nearly always get themselves done." She stood then, because she was not a woman built for staying long in tender rooms. She gathered her handbag. And then she drew an envelope out of it and set it down on the coffee bar, squarely, the way she set down everything. "That is my third of the shop," Diane said. "Your father left me a 1/3 share of Bennett and Sons, the business, not the walls, you never knew, because I never once made it a thing between us. Peter has been at me quietly for a month to sell my stake out from under you, which would have handed him a foot in the door to lever you off the block whether the freehold moved or not. I have come this morning to tell you that I have signed the whole of it over to you instead, free and clear, so that whatever you decide about the shop and about the boy and about your one wild and only life, you decide it holding every last thread of it in your own 2 hands, owing me nothing." At the door she paused without turning, in the very spot where Peter had paused, in the exact spot where Daniel had stood in the doorway the night before. "He did not buy you in order to manage you, Nora," she said to the street. "He bought you time because he happened to have time to give, and you did not, and he put it between you and the wolf without stopping to ask you to thank him for it, or even to notice it had happened. That is not a rich man rescuing a stray. That is exactly what your father did for me, quietly, every single day for 30 years, and I was too proud and too frightened to call it by its right name until he was under a stone, and it was 7 years too late." Her voice held perfectly level. "Do not wait for the stone. That is the whole of what I came to say. Do not wait for the stone." And she left, briskly the bell over the door announcing her out into the July morning, and Nora stood alone in her father's shop, holding the deed to her entire life in one hand, and finally understood what she had thrown away and precisely why, and that she had learned to do it, like everything else she knew, from the woman who had just walked out the door having handed her the world and asked for nothing at all in return, which was, she saw now, what love actually looked like when it was not written phonetically on the page of a cookbook. Nora did not run to him. She had run more than enough for one lifetime. She had, in truth, been running in one exhausting place for 7 years without ever moving an inch. Instead, she made herself do the slow, brave things, which were much harder than running. First, she telephoned Peter Vance and told him plainly that the answer was no, that it would always and forever be no, that Diane's third was hers now and the block was not for sale, not this September, and not any September to come. And Peter, to his lasting credit, laughed a little sadly down the line and said, "You know something, Nora? All these years I was so sure I'd lost you to the chef. It is oddly comforting, at my age, to find out I actually lost you to a bookshop with a bad roof. Take good care of yourself." And it was, at long last, a door closing gently instead of slamming, and it did not hurt her even slightly. Then she did the thing that truly cost her, which was to wait, to not fix it fast, to not go charging 2 doors down that same afternoon to perform a grand and sweeping romantic rescue that would let her feel brave without actually requiring her to be brave. She wrote it out first, longhand at the coffee bar, and she got it badly wrong 3 times because each time she kept making herself into either the rescued one or the wronged one, and it was only on the 4th draft, near midnight, that she managed to write it as the true one, which was the version where she was neither of those things, only a woman who had been a coward and had decided, at last, to stop. And then, the next day, the 1st of August, she did the thing her father had done maybe twice in 40 years. She closed the shop in the middle of a working afternoon. She hung the sign in the door, the actual sign, "Gone out," and she walked the 2 doors down to the altar in the white heat of the day. She did not go around to the kitchen door the way a girl slips in to see her sweetheart. She went in through the front, the way a person walks in to be seen in the full light of day. The lunchroom was crowded, half the town in it, forks stopping one by one as she came in, and Daniel came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel because someone had run back to tell him she was standing in his dining room. And Nora Bennett said the things she had come to say out loud, in front of every soul in the place, in the light. "You did not buy me a building," she said, and her voice carried, and the bright room went quiet in pieces around her. I told myself that story for a day and a half, and it was a lie, and I knew it was a lie the whole time I was telling it. You bought me time. And I have been so busy for 7 years making certain that nobody on this earth could ever manage me or handle me or rescue me, that I lost the ability to tell the difference between being handled and being held. And that is not your failure, Daniel, it is mine. And I learned it a long time ago, in a place I am only just now finding it in me to forgive. The towel had gone completely still in his hands. "I chose the safe thing on a porch when I was 21, she said, because I was certain, deep down, that you would leave me the second something better ever called your name. And instead, you went 3 states away and built an entire life, and you kept a shop receipt folded in your wallet for 7 years, and you turned down more money than I will ever see in order to stay 2 doors down from me. And you bought my father's roof in the dark and never once asked me to thank you for it or even to know. Nobody has ever chosen me the way you have chosen me, quietly, every single ordinary day, since you were 23 years old and could not afford the book you were reading. And I am done. I am done being far too sensible to want it." She was shaking. She let herself shake in front of the whole town and did not straighten a single thing. "So I'm asking you to choose me back," she said, out loud, in the daylight, in front of the entire town that was never once kind to you. "I am asking you to let me be the ruined loaf that you take home. I know now exactly what I am worth, and it is not a folder full of a developer's money, and it is not a safe door that will never slam. It is this. It is the next table 10 feet away for the rest of our lives. And I have come here today to close it." For a moment the whole restaurant held its breath as one animal, and Daniel Mercer, who had crossed 3 states in 7 long years and had not been able to cross a single dining room, crossed the dining room. He set the towel down on the pass. He came around it and through the staring tables and the stopped forks and stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the flour and the burnt sugar and the herbs from the little walled garden, and he said, low, only for her, exactly the way he had said her name that very first night one table over, "You do know, it's alphabetical. Bennett, then Mercer. You come first, Nora. You were always going to come first. Don't you dare read anything into it," she whispered, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time, both at once, and he kissed her in the full bright daylight of his own dining room while the Historical Society applauded, and a busboy dropped an entire tray of glasses, and the whole small thimble of a town got the story right for one single time. Watched it happen with their own 2 eyes, the bookshop girl and the boy who had read cookbooks standing up because he wanted the world too much to sit, 7 years late, and exactly, precisely, on time. They did not marry that summer. There is a version of this story where they did, fast and grand and photographed, and it is a distinctly worse version. What actually happened was slower and quieter, and it was entirely theirs. They kept 2 shops, 2 doors apart, on the same block that a developer had wanted whole and never got. And when September came anyway, the way September always comes, the word that neither of them had been able to say all summer arrived without ending anything, because there was nothing left in it that needed to end. He was not going anywhere. Neither was she. The ladder that Daniel Mercer had spent his whole hungry life climbing turned out, in the end, to have its highest rung right there on Alder Street, in a small town that had finally, grudgingly, learned to say his name with respect. They fought about the shelves for the rest of their lives. He left one book sticking half an inch proud every single night until he was an old man, and she never once got used to it, which was, they both understood, entirely the point. She got steadily worse at testing hot pans, and he never once stopped being patient with her about it, which was also the point. Diane came to Sunday supper and was terrible and beloved in equal measure, and once, only ever the one time, she told the whole story of the man who had wanted her to go to sea, and Daniel listened to every word of it with his whole open face. And then he went quietly into the kitchen and named a bread after her. A stubborn, dense, difficult loaf that only improved with age and would not be rushed for anyone, and Diane pretended to be deeply insulted by it and kept the framed menu on her wall until the day she followed Marlowe under the stone, many good years later, unafraid at the last. And every summer, when the fair took over Alder Street, the booth on the corner gave away lost bread. Free, to a line 40 deep in the heat, under a hand-lettered sign that read in two names, alphabetically, Bennett A&D Mercer, and underneath it, smaller, so that you had to lean all the way in to read it, so that it was really only meant for the two of them, and for anyone in the crowd brave enough to come that close, it means lost bread. The ruined loaf, the one everybody gave up on, you soak it, and you don't rush it, and you make it better than it ever was new. And then you take it home. Nora kept her father's ring in a small dish on the windowsill, and somewhere in those good years she stopped needing to turn it between her fingers in the dark. Because here, in the end, is the thing she finally understood, the thing it had taken her 7 years and a stepmother's grief and a shop receipt and a wallet to learn. Love does not always arrive on time, in the seat you carefully saved for it, through the front door at 8 o'clock sharp. Sometimes it has been sitting one table over the entire while, 10 feet and 7 years away, gone quiet, gone stale, given up on by everyone in the room, including its own self, waiting only, and for as long as it has to, for someone finally brave enough to stop straightening the spines and push back the chair and cross the room and take it home.